Right, welcome back. We are now into the second session, panel 3, on a very, very critical theme, reactions and responses from state and society. We had two very, very engrossing rounds, first on causes, patterns, and consequences, then the second, again, the second panel on more or less the same theme. We have three very eminent panelists today, Professor Vivian Hsu, Professor Ching Kwon Lee, and Professor Deves Kapoor. And I'm sure we are going to have a very, very interesting discussion also after their presentations. So may I invite Professor Vivian Hsu to make her presentations.
Thank you very much. Do we have one of these pointers?
She would be. Do you have a pointer?
There was one earlier. I don't need it right away, but if we could find one, thank you. I'd like to begin by thanking the conference organizers for inviting me. I very much appreciated the premise on which this conference was organized, and it was my first chance to come to the New School. I think this is an exciting meeting, so I'm glad to be here. Thank you. The topic for this panel, though, is a very large one. We're supposed to be discussing the social responses and reactions to prosperity amidst poverty and inequality. I'm going to say just a few summary words about social responses. I would like to pick up where Kelly Tsai was earlier this morning when she said something about the egalitarian nature, the ultra-egalitarian nature of the Maoist beginning point at the onset of the reforms, and how there were problems and more social hierarchy there than is often understood to be the case. I agree with this, but I also agree with her emphasis on the politicization, however, of the equality issue. The fact that inequality had been struggled against so repeatedly, and was such a social issue, I think is the backdrop against which we need to understand many of the social reactions that have come since the onset of the reforms. Ever since Deng Xiaoping did famously say it would be okay to let some get rich first, and since then I think social relations around this issue have been extremely diverse. They've always been the responses from society have always been very mixed, and thank you, and changing. As differing groups in society have been impacted differently by the rapid transformations taking place. And these social responses have run the gamut from delirious embrace of market reforms and of risk and of chance and of the socioeconomic stratification that followed, on the one hand, to quite cynical rejections of market ideology as rigged always in favor of those who already possess wealth and power, and as the turn toward reform as a naked betrayal of socialist values, and most bitterly expressed resentment on the part of many people at the deep sense of loss and abandonment that many, many have suffered. And these are, as Kelly also mentioned, often associated with condemnations of official and corporate corruption. Now, C.K. Lee, luckily, is here today. She is a sociologist, and she will speak in a far more nuanced way than I can about the diversities and intensities of responses and reactions across society. I am a mere political scientist, and so I will focus more prosaically on the state, and I want to talk a little bit about the positions of the political intelligentsia. And when I think about this, I do find it useful, as some of the other speakers today have already shown, to think roughly in terms of decades. And so I'll quickly whiz through some of the decades, then I'd like to talk the decades past and what I see as the main political and state responses during that period, and then I would like to come and focus a little bit more on some aspects of the 12th five-year plan and where we are right now. And one in particular, which is a new spatial planning regime, which has come, nationwide spatial planning regime, which has come in with the 12th five-year plan. And my slides are mostly about that, so in due course. The 1980s, I think we have to understand, did not see the sudden rejection of socialist ideals that's often depicted to have occurred. It was actually, in retrospect, a period of, that was quite highly fraught with ideological and power political contention, and during which the market socialists gained a tentative but always contested upper hand as against the anarcho-socialists, the utopian socialists, and the state socialist elements that all were coexisting within the party leadership. As has been said, the easiest reform tasks were tackled first, more difficult ones were left till later, and China's distinctive pattern of decentralizing authority to lower levels of the state and empowering those lower levels of the state to become market actors began to take shape in the 1980s. Even so, the first severe pains of emerging inequalities and unanticipated anomalies in the distribution of wealth and benefits were already sharply felt, all of which contributed to the political crisis of 1989 in Tiananmen. Following the overcome of the crisis, the 1990s I see as rather a schizophrenic decade, and I'm interested to see that some of the reports on economic trends and inequality trends in India seem to parallel this. There was a dramatic opening in China during that decade to global trade and investment. So the scope of change that was taking place and the sums involved began to just soar, and the country saw both much more dramatic market successes than it had seen in the 80s and much more painful market failures. During the first half of the decade, more and more resources and more authority and more discretion continued to drift downward to lower levels of the state, the provinces, the big urban municipalities, and even down to county level officials. And the great accomplishment, I think, of the Jiang Zemin government in the middle of the decade of the 90s was to begin to turn that process around, to turn that dispersal downward of wealth and power around by reclaiming control over the intergovernmental fiscal system and replenishing gradually the central budget. So with unprecedented growth still marching on, the central government gradually was able to become fiscally empowered once again, but it was too late to prevent widespread incidents of social unrest through the latter part of the 90s, to prevent widespread disgust and angry outcries against the unfairnesses of the system. So during this decade, also, Chinese social thinkers and public intellectuals began dividing into liberal and new left camps, those who were inspired by reading Hayek on the one hand, and those who championed notions of the regulatory state on the other. And as these intellectual debates matured and raged on, the economy continued to grow without pause. Both the central and the many, many local state jurisdictions became wealthier and more empowered, while other groups and districts were more and more markedly left behind and feeling the pain of economic restructuring more and more acutely. Which brings us to the first decade, then, of this century, which opened with China, I think, nothing short of a heaving cauldron of discontent. 10 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we are now, in my chronology, China was awash with protesters of all kinds, ranging from the self-immolating Falun Gong to the savvy nationalist outrage of urban youth behaving badly after NATO's bombing of the embassy in Belgrade. And real fears the system being overwhelmed by this kind of unpremeditated and unplanned for protest, I think, gripped the center. The debates between the liberals who were championing the market, not the riots, the liberals were championing the market as the engine of the economy, and the new left on the other side who were championing the need for enhanced state capacity to guide economic and social development. This led to a new attempt at a synthesis by the party leadership. And when Hu Jintao came to power in 2002, along with Wen Jiabao, the beginning of the effort to promote scientific development perspective. The key goals of this scientific development perspective, which is what I would like to spend some time on, are, in case you haven't read, sustainable development, greatly expanded systems of social welfare, nurturing a more humane society, gradually increasing democracy, all ultimately leading to the creation of a much less tension-ridden and more harmonious society. I'm sure you've heard of that one. The basic premise is that it is possible for the state to engineer sustainable development with better trained, much better trained, and much better quality state personnel, and through flexibly testing and practically proving the better methods of governance. The expectation is that taking this scientific perspective on and taking this kind of approach to governance should reduce unfairness, and so it should reduce conflict among different groups in society in order to maintain political stability that's conducive to still greater economic and cultural advancement overall. The scientific development concept has been thoroughly articulated now over the past decade, and it's greatly supported and enhanced wealth that the center has and its planning capacity and the upgrading of the personnel who work there. All of this now resides at the center, and this has given them more confidence to push forward along this line. This line was firmly embodied in the 11th five-year plan, which ran from 2007 to 11, and it's reached, I think, a kind of spectacular manifestation in the 12th five-year plan, which brings us to where we are today. And it's brought us to this development, I think, this spectacular level of development in addressing the problems of balanced development and inequality in China. This is an approach that is unabashedly rational statist and social welfarist without in the least abandoning the romance of the market, one that I think is stunning in its commandingly elite technocratic ambition, even as it imagines itself serving the people and serving indeed the planet. Page down. Here we go. I've got it. Okay. I just want to run through some of the relevant components of the 12th five-year plan in fields like public education and social welfare. We're going to have to move through these very, very quickly. They are simply the articulation of state goals, right? But most of these come with targets, and many of them come with what are known as hard targets in China now, which means that local level cadres do not have a choice about whether to implement these. They must implement them. It's a matter, they are binding targets. And although none of this will be fully accomplished in the next 5 years, in the next 5 years, and the next 5 years after that, and the next 5 years after that, there are percentage-wise targets that are supposed to be met. And they involve, they involve promises to the people like these, like 9-year compulsory free education, fees exempted for the boarding schools that Yao Yang was talking about, vocational education that's free, subsidies provided to children who are from poor families. That's ways of overcoming the distortions in education that we saw in the 1990s in the past decade. Here we see also such high goals in urban and rural. I want to show you that. These are urban and rural, basic pension schemes, basic medical insurance, in urban unemployment insurance programs. These are all programs on which a certain amount of progress has already been registered. This, I think, is mostly still a wish list, but helping people to find employment and giving them advice on employment, further vocational training for rural migrant workers. And you know that in China now the discourse is very much on upgrading the status of migrants as they come and moving toward a gradual abolition of the hukou system, which is what gives an inferior status to migrants. On the housing front, low-rent housing, here's an example, a concrete example. In the 12th five-year plan, 36 million low-income apartment units. This is one of those hard targets I mentioned to you. It also extends to actual redistribution of wealth, the goal being to reverse the trend toward a widening income gap using taxation and wage systems, the social security net, public service provision, and a tremendous emphasis is put on public service provision, and in the 12th five-year plan, especially on the equalization of public service provision and across different communities all over the country, as well as direct transfer of payments. The idea is that historically, eventually, public service provision would become more or less equal, but that process now needs to be speeded up with done much more hastily. This is a map I included just for people who are more used to looking at maps of India than China, just to remind you that on the spatial distribution of wealth and poverty, that it's this dark red strand here where we have the concentrations of the greatest wealth, followed by these darker pink areas where middling incomes, and this great area from the Tibetan plateau in Xinjiang across the grasslands and up into the forests of Heilongjiang, with these two poorer central provinces being still quite far behind. That's the general layout, and I want to put that in your minds just because I want to move on to spatial questions for the remainder of what I have to say. I mentioned the coming of the scientific approach. It's also been to development. It's also been accompanied by the move from balanced development to what's called coordinated development. If I can go back to this map, you can see that this pattern of wealth distribution was regarded as one that could be dealt with by rebalancing from East Coast, Center, and the far west. But now that's no longer regarded as an adequate approach, and instead coordinated development, which refers to addressing all aspects of development at the same time in a comprehensive way and in a sustainable way, bringing nature and economy and society all into play, is the official approach. I think I'd better hurry along, so I'm not going to spend time here. I have some maps, other maps I want to show you. These come out of the 12th five-year plan, and this one has gotten some play. You may have run across it because it represents the plans for urbanization to be carried out under between now and 2050. That's 38 years remaining, during which China is supposed to plans to create 3 mega urban agglomerations, 20 large urban agglomerations, 10, including 5 ultra-mega cities with populations over 10 million. 10 megacities with populations over 5 million, 50 major cities with populations over 1 million, 150 large cities with populations of 500,000, 200 medium-sized cities, and 250 small-sized cities. And they are to be created along these 3 vertical belts and 2 horizontal belts of urban development. How to do that and also carry out coordinated development, including nature, and social harmony. This is the task of the part of the program that I'd like to show you now. It involves what I call zoning the nation, setting out which is a plan that was in process for more than 4 years, based on high-tech investigations from including geospatial imaging and satellite imaging and other kinds of investigations. After 4 years of this kind of empirical research, a national spatial master plan was developed. It's the first ever intended to govern the development and the use of the whole of the national territory, all its land and all its waters. And this is called the Principal Function Zoning Plan, and it stipulates that all of China's land and waters are to be classified into categories according to which the main function is that each area is deemed to perform. The categorical zoning assignment will in turn determine the speed and the extent to which the guidelines, and the guidelines according to which each zone or space is allowed to develop. And their functions are urban industrial functions, rural agricultural functions, and ecological functions. And ecological functions are conceived as the generation of essential ecological products, such as clean water and fresh air, and sufficient biodiversity to sustain a tolerable climate and an environment. According to the master plan, once these functions are determined, then each area will be divided further into areas that can be optimized development. These are the ones where development has already extensively gone on, and where development has to be kept within where it's approaching its limits, and where better technologies have to be used if further development is to take place. Prioritized development zones, which you see are more toward the center of the country, where basically urbanization and further development can go ahead. I'm running out of time. Restricted development, which is broken into two: agricultural development, that areas that will be set aside for agricultural and agricultural services. Environmental is the other restricted area where special fragile ecologies are involved. And then prohibited development zones, which are of such fragility that they are not to be further developed at all. I will wind up by simply saying this gives you a taste of the approach that's being taken to major development issues. The contemporary Chinese approach is rooted in long-term forecasting and elite technocratic guidance, high-tech rational scientific envisioning of the future, comprehensive state planning and state execution that's meant to address and solve social problems, backed up with an array of compensatory cash payments, which I haven't had time to develop, but would be happy to entertain questions about, and various incentives and other inducements to promote compliance by local officials and ordinary citizens with these plans and dreams. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Xu. You gave a very interesting account of how redirections of development interventions are being done in the 12th five-year plan, and also repositioning of the institutions, including of the delivery of services in China. We would, I'm sure we are going to have a very interesting discussions on these two very, very interesting themes. Let me now invite Professor Ching Guan Li to make her presentation, please.
Thank you very much, and it's a privilege to be here in this very exciting institute. I also want to thank in particular Sanjay, who allows me to jump ship practically and not to talk about rights activism and protests that I've been studying for a long time, and to shift focus to talk about the state, and particularly how the Chinese state devises strategies to absorb the numerous incidents of unrest that has been happening on a daily basis. In the past 20 years, as Kelly reminded us this morning, actually the volume of popular unrest has increased dramatically. And if we try to quantify these numbers on a per day basis, we'll be dealing with, or the Chinese state will be actually is dealing with 500 incidents of mass disturbance per day. So the question for me for the 15 minutes that I have today, I'd like to present to you some findings from a research that I've been doing together with another colleague, following grassroots officials who are tasked with this unenviable job of dealing with and confronting protesters. What happened when, in your jurisdiction, several hundred or dozens of protests happens every day? How do they deal with and absorb? What kind of strategies do they have in absorbing these protests? I'm going to spare you with this kind of theoretical framing, and just to alert you to the fact that I'm not talking about the entire China. It's impossible for me to do it with this research. Our research is really based in big cities, Shenzhen and Beijing, from 2008 to 2011, and including not just the urban centers, but the peri-urban areas. So we do have quite a number of not just labor unrest and property rights-based unrest, but also land right unrests. We've been following some of these officials, and we have conducted a large number of interviews together, not just with the state officials, but also the protesters. So basically, to sort of give you the gist of the argument, what we have found is that these days, grassroots governments, they have three major mechanisms of dealing with unrest in achieving what have been called, quote unquote, harmonious society. And these three major mechanisms are deployed very flexibly, and they can be activated to deal with any single incident simultaneously or selectively. The first one is a mechanism that works through the logic of the market, and we will call it buying stability, and that's actually the English translation of a Chinese term. The second one is the government uses a plethora of bureaucratic rules. We call that bureaucratic games. And then the third is domination working through social networks. And that continues the argument that Andrew Walder has been making 20, 30 years ago, patron clientelism. And what we have found is that all three processes or mechanisms have the power effect of depoliticizing unrest. That is, to take politics out of unrest and turn unrest into something that is manageable, either through the logic of bargaining with protesters and exchanging loyalty or compliance with material interest, or absorbing them through the gigantic bureaucratic machinery of all kinds of rules and procedures. Or the third mechanism is really through working through social relations, interpersonal bonds that are both instrumental and personal and emotional. So the first one, buying stability, this actually is the term that we've been told by officials. There is a policy of 花钱买平安. In every local government, and we're talking about street government in urban areas and township government in rural areas, they have what they call stability maintenance fund. And these are funds that government has to set aside to give and pay to protesters. And it has ballooned to such an extent that since last year, Financial Times carry the story saying that domestic security expenses in China exceeded national security expenses for the first time. And they projected to continue that trend. And so part of that money, we don't know how much, but part of that money has been used to pay out to protesters in the form of cash, but a lot of time also in form of services. So if the bone of contention that happens in a particular district has to do with wage payment, then the fund will be used to pay some of the due wages. Or if it has to do with some water supply, electricity supply, then the fund will be used to provide that kind of service. Sometimes the money is used to build a school, if that's what the residents want. They want better schools for their kids, and in exchange for quitting the protest about their property rights or property disputes. It has become a very routinized kind of rituals between these grassroots officials and protesters that people studying China must have heard of this. Big disturbance, big resolution, small disturbance, small resolution, no disturbance, no resolution. So the game is really to make disturbance so that local officials would really respond to your demands and at least listen to you. So what have happened then is what we call a commodification of state authority and citizens' rights. That is, authority and rights now carry a price tag, and you can bargain and exchange. So we call it's really authority appealing to the logic of the market, and citizens routinely traded rights for material benefits. What we also found, which is really interesting, is that the essence of this strategy of domination is not really in the final payment or the delivery of service. It is really in the process of bargaining. And if we want to understand why China has been able to maintain overall stability, the processes are really what we have to look at. So I'm going to give you a very quick sort of summary of the component processes that are involved in bargaining between officials and protesters. They all amount to, these component processes amount to what we call a non-zero-sum bargaining. That is, citizens or protesters feel that their relation with officials is no longer antagonistic. There can be some compromises between them. And these kind of bargaining result in a pragmatic, precarious alliance between state agents, local state agents, and citizens, and both benefit from instability. And this is something that I will explain in a minute. But these component processes are the things that would happen when officials have to arrive on the scene and actually talk to protesters. And what they do is many local officials and government units have developed flow charts where they will categorize events according to the number of people involved, the kind of money amount that are involved. And they would have an automatic system where one official will be responsible for one category of event. So when we were dining with officials, they'll be constantly looking at their cell phones because somebody at the call center of the local government would feed information to these respective officials. One of them will have to arrive on scene, like within 5 minutes, and then others will be notified. So our interviewees or subjects would always be looking at their cell phone and their iPad and whatever I think they have. And undivided attention. They'll be talking to us, but looking at that. And some of them will just told us, oh, somebody, we have 100 people blocking certain road, and somebody is going there right now, and I'm being informed. So it's a very systematic and very expedient way of categorizing and sending people there. And when they arrived on the scene, the first thing is emotion control. It's not talking about money, but it's really to calm them down, give them cell phones so that they know if workers are protesting, these workers will have the cell phone of this local official. If they want to call them, they have somebody to talk to. The second thing that would happen is that the officials will always want them to select representatives. Out of several hundred people or a dozen people, they want representatives so that they can fragment the group. They can talk to these representatives and buy them off. So when you have 3 representatives, they can talk to these 3 people and say, what are your personal needs? And we'll satisfy you and break up the group. The third important component process is that they would try to shape the protesters' conception of their right. Many of these protesters, whether peasants, workers, or homeowners, they started out knowing their rights from the law books. That's where they start out. but they don't stay with that kind of conceptions. Once officials arrive on the scene, they talk them through a lengthy process of negotiation to transform their notions of right. That's why we call it a joint construction of rights. And it is very different from what the China literature has told us, that there are all these rights-conscious protests. Yes, but the significant thing is these rights can change, and they're changed by officials who try to make them realize legal rights on the book are not realistic. You have to take into account that this is an authoritarian country. If you insist on those rights, go to the court, but you won't get anything. Be pragmatic and accept what we are going to offer you. So there is a lot of transformation in the process of bargaining, and that's why they insist on not just give them the money, but to talk to them over a period of time. All these happen while the use of threat is always in sight. They may not always arrest people, but everybody in the situation knows that force can be invoked anytime. So there is an undeniable amount of coercion that is at work here. And finally, what we realized very interesting is that protesters try to capitalize on unrest, stage unrest so that they can get concession from the government. But these grassroots officials also benefit from instability. They don't want to see the disappearance of instability because once there is instability, they can legitimately ask for an expanded budget. And their career could also, they can promote their own career, they can rise up the local hierarchy from the street level government to the city and upward, because a certain level of controllable instability attests to their significance, to their values, and they want to capitalize on this as well. So that's why we call it a non-zero-sum game, because both sides, citizens, protesters, and local state officials, they actually want this. They can generate some kind of benefits on both sides. And so we're going to see, if this goes on, I think we're going to see for the foreseeable future, there will be always a certain level of instability, unrest, but it doesn't mean the whole regime is going to collapse. I think quite the reverse is true, because they worked out this very pragmatic alliance between protesters and lower-level government. Of course, there will be a physical crisis if they do that for indefinitely, but, well, physical crisis, in this day and age, we have seen many physical crises that plague many nation states, and I don't know whether this is something that we have to worry about China or not. Okay, the second mechanism that we have found in this research is what we call bureaucratic absorption. And this kind of revises our view about China as an authoritarian regime, which of course it is, but the one-party state has also many mechanisms where it can incorporate people into its machinery of domination or governance, not by democratic electoral processes, but by undemocratic channels where people actually can voice their grievances and have certain kind of procedures to process and to submit their grievance and demands. So there are a whole set of bureaucratic and legal games, including petition, mediation, arbitration, litigation, where rules of the state, with rules that the state can deploy arbitrarily, and into which collective incidents can be bureaucratically processed and thereby demobilized. And anyone who has gone through the court system would know how long it would take, and if it is a collective case, then the chances are that the group will be broken up, and it's very hard to sustain solidarity through a very lengthy process of these bureaucratic resolution. Also, participation in these games itself, regardless of the outcome, generates and reproduces consent to its rules. To just show you a list of major laws that have generated all kinds of games and which have absorbed many people with grievance to the bureaucracy. And these are laws that target all the major rights violation, major conflicts that have given rise to the large volume of unrest. These games, these rules, oftentimes they are deployed simultaneously, so at the same time, officials, and at any one point in time, officials and protesters will be playing these multiple games. And in our field work, we have found that officials can substitute games, rules, very easily. If you file a lawsuit in the court, the judge would force you into mediation. So immediately they changed the game to mediation. They can also very skillfully use election to absorb dissent. Elected leaders in rural areas, they would be co-opted once they become elected. So election allows handles for the government to deal with dissent and also unrest. And citizens play the game, and they have these different expressions: fighting a land, sea, air battle, meaning that you have to play multiple games at the same time with the government. The third mechanism is kind of classic Chinese communist strategy that has been well analyzed by Andrew Walter. Although we found that these days patron-clientelist networks do not exist as much in work units as in neighborhoods. Work units, socialist work units have declined, and clients these days are no longer the party activists in these work units. There are 4 types of people who are still under the market economy, still kind of more or less dependent on the state. You have civil servants, party members, elderlies and retirees in neighborhoods. They are a very strong force in allowing the government to dissolve and absorb dissent and protest, because these people have time in their hands, and also they command a certain respect in the family, so they are very effective agents to persuade their daughters and sons not to participate in anti-government protest. And then you have former protest leaders. Because of the long negotiation between these local officials and the protest leaders, they become friends, and there are a lot of material exchanges between these protest leaders and the officials. So patron-clientelism is the kind of strategy of power that works through interpersonal relations that are material, instrumental, but also genuinely affectionate and effective, and it's really personal relations. And it falls into a very long tradition of Communist Party's mass work, although the focus and the agents and the targets involved have changed over the years. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but just to my last point about patron-clientist network is that in neighborhoods these days, there's still a very elaborate network of information collection. So there are tons of hired, part-time intelligence people. There are just your regular neighbors who are populated in these neighborhoods, and they provide lots of real-time information to the local officials. And of course, local officials many of them begin their workday 8 o'clock in the morning by checking all the online sites of property owners, their forums, and they have targeted neighborhoods to know and monitor the emergent conflicts and complaints. What are we going to make of these 3 mechanisms? I think all these processes preserve stability by depoliticizing official-citizen confrontation. And by that I mean the government has been very effective in transforming contestations about political power and political values into bargains of material interests, bureaucratic and legal games, and interpersonal bonds. And I think that explains why the majority of social unrest in China seldom challenges the legitimacy and system of one-party rule, but has mostly focused on issues of livelihood and material interests. But I also like to emphasize that this is a very precarious kind of domination that the party has maintained. It is wrought with uncertainty and unpredictability, mostly because all these mechanisms actually relies on processes rather than institutions. So as a whole, China still lacks, there's a very serious deficit of democratic institutions that could allow this very peaceful and regular kind of absorption of resolution of conflicts. And it relies on local government officials' techniques in absorbing conflicts through these processes of absorption. And whenever you have officials who are not very as skillful whenever you have recalcitrant protesters, cohesive, very daring group of protesters, then you will have explosive events, which we have seen in the past year, like Wuhan. And so I think the whole, the system so far hasn't devised a very stable institutional way of handling the massive number of incidents of unrest, but they have found processes, power in processes to sort of co-opt and absorb these. And in the long run, I think any occurrence of economic stagnation or physical crisis will or may dramatically limit the Chinese state capacity to contain unrest by buying people off. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Lee, for bringing out absolutely a new dimension to the entire inequality management discourse. May I now invite Professor Devis Kapoor to make his presentation.
Thank you. This morning, in trying to understand these sort of responses like from the Indian state, our discussions focused on sort of intentions. This afternoon, I want to shift it to the capabilities sort of the Indian state. So to shift it from intentions to competence. What is it that the Indian state is capable of doing, even if it had the right sort of intentions? And much of the last few years, the discussions sort of on the Indian state have focused on corruption. And I want to shift that a little bit to competence. We focused a lot on policies, but I think, and this is a huge and especially stark contrast with China, which I believe that the differences between the two states are not so much about policies, but their ability to implement them. And so this shifts our discussions like from the what, which is the policy, like to the how. How are you going to sort of implement it? Now, when we think of state capacity in India, like much other of our discussions on sort of India, it's full of paradoxes, right? It can manage highly complex tasks. I mean, I think the ability in which it can organize sort of elections, it's an incredibly complex exercise. And I would say that it does it better than the United States, with far less levels of income and a far more complex sort of environment. It has, by and large, very effectively managed its armed forces in a very reasonably apolitical manner, runs a very efficient, if not the world's most sort of cost-efficient space program. But when it comes to the basics, basic public services, what I call the core public administration, it does a terrible job, right? And so part of the thing is to understand why it can do some things which are complex, complicated so well, and why does it fail so miserably at things that which we sort of think were done like 100 years back. So one of the misconceptions sort of about the Indian state is that it's a massive apparatus. What I first want to take you through slides to say, India has one of the smallest bureaucracies in the world for the size of its population. Most people simply do not realize that. It's over-bureaucratized, but it's undermanned. It's undermanned, especially when we look at indicators of competence, which I'll come to sort of later. So public sector employment, when you add up everything, really peaked by the early 90s. And it's about 10% less in absolute terms. If you control by population, it's about a quarter less. This was the point that Atul made about jobless growth. These numbers about the organized sector employment. Private sector employment has increased. It's especially increased actually last 3-4 years. But again, that increase is a very small fraction relative to the increase of the population. If you look at the total size, you'll see that between after 1991, the main growth of the public sector really took place in the 70s and 80s. After that, it's been flat, if not falling. Here's a comparative thing. If you look at tax sort of employment, and you look how tiny is the size of the tax enforcement machinery of the Indian state relative to other countries, right? It's virtually orders of magnitude smaller when you compare it to countries like the UK or France. If you look at a bigger puzzle, and this is especially a number of people in political science, especially call India a sort of patronage democracy. What's puzzling is why, if India is a patronage democracy, are so many public sectors sort of employment is actually unfilled. I'll take you through the vacancies in the Indian government. That's the vacancy rate. In the army, the officer shortage is about, that's about 1/4, and that's a fairly sizable shortage. So police, right? If you take, say, the weighted average of 48 countries, and you take Germany as our norm of an efficient state, so India has far less policemen. Now, as we'll see, the implications of this are complex, because if you say, so what? If the police themselves are a cause of crime, that might be a very nice thing. You want... So let's sort of see what are these sorts of implications. I'm just taking this as an example. And we'll see if you look at the most recent data I've been able to put together. So about 500,000 vacancies in the police across India. That's a massive number, right? If you think about it. It's about 1/4. And the state, which is supposedly the states recognized as patronage democracies, UP, which is India's largest state, the vacancy is 60%. So why don't these politicians stuff these jobs? I mean, that's what patronage democracies do, right? Politicians stuff public sector jobs for the boys. But actually, it's just not the case. I mean, you cannot expect vacancies of 200,000 people. You look at Bihar for like teachers. Again, the vacancies rates are in hundreds of thousands, right? So besides that, of course, I'm here only talking of quantity. We haven't even touched quality, right? That's a completely different issue about training, about funding for equipment, all of that stuff. So if we think about what are the possible implications of this, right? Because policing, law and order is one of the most basic core functions of the state, right? So here's some, what I want to sort of argue is that it's not a simple thing to draw causal effects. So this is data on riots in India over the past half century, right? So it's a long-term time series. I've normalized this by population. It'll change somewhat, but the trends, I think, will not change, which we've done. So riots in India actually peaked out, very different from China, in the early 80s. And they've fallen very sharply, actually, since then. They are about 1/3, actually, of what they were in the early 1980s. Most people believe India has become more violent. Actually, that's just not the case. If you look at homicide rates, that's private violence, right, homicide. And by the way, crime data in countries like India or most other countries is abysmal. The only crime data that you can slightly use is where there are physical bodies, and that's homicides, right? So that's the only one which I'm going to use. And I know we can talk about other types of violence, and which may well have increased, but this is the only one that I believe we can trust if we look sort of over time and space. So homicide rates actually sort of in India are less than the United States. This when the number of police in India is a fraction that of the US, so there are far fewer policemen per million. And the incarceration rates in India per million population are less than 10% that of the United States. So it's not that India has put all the bad guys behind bars, on the contrary. But actually, if we know, the composition of Indian state assemblies and parliaments, the bad guys are actually in parliament. Okay, so violence is, you see few policemen, doesn't seem to really have that bad. If we look at political violence, and the data is over a shorter period of time, it's the last like 12 years, but basically, it's actually a very sharp fall in most areas of what I call political violence, right? Jammu and Kashmir, it's about 1/6 sort of its peak in the early 2000s. The same with the Northeast. It's actually fallen, especially in the last few years. The only communal violence which is much played on both in Indian academia as well as in American academia is actually much, much lower. There was this peak in 2002, which we all know. But otherwise, it's been fairly stable. There hasn't been much change. These numbers, by the way, are not normalized. These are raw numbers. If you had those, it would be. The only violence which has actually increased, political violence, is Maoist violence. And that there is, it's not just that it's not declined, but it appears to be slightly increasing. So, so if you think of one measure of state capabilities, which is police, you say, well, you have far, you should have more, all of these, and you say, well, the effects, at least on one aspect of better policing or worse, which is violence, there seems to be a very weak correlation. But that's not the full story. This is about corruption. So India has, it's not, by no means this is the equivalent of the FBI here, but this is India's sort of central investigative agency on corruption. Now, if you look at the, I think the data is sort of indicative of capabilities. The total number of cases that were registered, so what the CBI's role is to register cases is to investigate and then register cases of corruption against public officials, right? So it's not about private, it's just very strictly on public sort of officials. Now, the total number of cases filed from 2009 to 11 was about 2,000 odd cases. The charge sheets filed was just 16, right? It's less than 1%. Now, in some ways, if you talk to anyone who works in these, that is a measure of competence, right? You can investigate, but look, nothing, it doesn't lead to anything. And one simple thing is actually, if you look at sort of vacancies, you find that if you look at a supply chain of investigation to prosecution, you of course need, you don't just need the investigative part, you need people who are like lawyers who prepare these cases. And you see there that the vacancy rate is about a third. Now, again, I want to stress the competence of these guys is a huge issue. I've not even got there. But even just raw numbers, right, for the entire country of 1.2 billion people, where corruption is so rife, even then you can barely get 200 lawyers for your entire investigation, right? I mean, that's the scale of the magnitude of this problem. Now, what are the root causes? So here is some things about Indian administrative service, the federal government, about exam taking, right? So like in China, everything is sort of driven by exams. So as you can see, these are the main civil service exams. And for most of these services, the APR, which is the application to post ratio. So basically, for every vacancy, hundreds of people are taking these exams, right? By the way, it's far harder if you look at the application to post ratio to get into any of these services compared to getting into Harvard or Princeton or Yale. I mean, these ratios it's an order of magnitude harder. At least if you look at the number of people who apply per vacancy. But I'll just take you, one of the things, of course, is if you ask, why is it that it's so low in sort of geologists? It's only 13. One of the things that we're sort of trying to look at is the ability to make rents and how many people apply. If you're a geologist, you can't make money. I mean, that's pretty clear. So there's not much interest. So if you're trained as a geologist, you will apply for the civil services if you want to make money, but you will not work as a geologist. It's, I mean, life is tough and you don't make that much money. Now, but I'll take you to something which I've been thinking about more, which is the Indian Economic Service, the Indian Statistical Service. Now note that there, what you have is that even with all the applicants, right, it can barely fill up, like 2/3 of barely 50 vacancies which they have. This number has increased because if you look at the numbers for the entire decade, by and large, the Indian Statistics Service, which is all government statisticians that supply the data, that run the National Sample Survey, that run the state statistical offices, all of that, by and large, India has barely been able to find 30 people a year to fill its services. So you have the vacancy rates there are about 1/3 to 1/2 now. Now, this is reflected in something which I think we are seeing, those of us who work with Indian data. The quality of government data has been declining sharply. There's no two ways about it. And of course, because you don't have competent people. You don't have, now it's a long story which I won't get into here about how that relates to the quality of Indian higher education, because that's the pool from which you are going to recruit from. Now, okay, so, one of the things that old quip that India is all society and no state, and China is all state and no society. One of the ways it's sort of reflected is in NGOs, right? These are the data which we put together on NGOs in India. They've increased about 30-fold, right? They're all in millions now. And the question is, which you want to ask is, do these complement or substitute for the state? And as you know, with these NGOs, they do everything from good to bad, and they're as much involved in money laundering and extortion as they are in actual, genuine public services. The other thing which is interesting is, I think that we don't quite understand, is the relationship between professional bodies and the competence of the Indian state. By this I mean the Medical Council of India, the Bar Council of India, all the professional certification the bodies, which have actually got statutory independence from acts of parliament, yet their ability to self-govern has been so weak, so poor. So it's the middle class's own abilities, because these are professionals are what is the quintessential middle class, which spills over into the weaknesses of the Indian state. Now, what I'd like to say is that the challenges that India faces of the state are very different, because the economy has changed, the role of the state is bound to change, right? It's changing from production to regulation. The needs are much more not at the national, but at the local because of decentralization, much more about urban governance as India urbanizes. It's not about managing industry, but as we know about India, about managing natural resources, which are in severe limitation, whether it's land, water, or energy. It's not about control, but coordination. And I think one of the things that is clear is that so much of the debates by Indian intellectuals about the state as a site of social justice was all about representation in the state. But I think much less as the state itself as the vehicle of social justice. And I think in trying to work on this, I think trying to think it through is, at every level, we're surprised there's virtually very little academic work, because, of course, in academia, there's nothing as boring as public administration, right? It's a field that has been completely thrown out of the world, because it doesn't meet the demands of high-powered academic journals. So there's zero academic incentives to work on it. I think this is something we should be very clear is how academic incentives shape our understanding of what's happening. And I think state capacity is definitely one of those places. And if you look at studies about about the selection processes, intra-organizational practices, how and when people exit, there is virtually zero work in the past 30 to 40 years. Most of the work is pre-70s. After that, we have very little understanding. So I'll sort of end with this, that which is, as India's economy, as it grows, structural transformation, what I want to say is that the challenges actually are going to be greater, not less. And improving the performance of the state, I think, is going to be much more fundamental than we think. And understanding how this can sort of happen or sort of may not happen is therefore very important. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We have how many minutes now? 15 minutes? 15. Let me just raise 3 points that relates to both this session and the session in the morning. In the morning session, and I think to a large extent in this session also, a very interesting issue emerged, that is of regional disparity. Among the 3 disparities and inequalities we discussed this morning. And this morning we saw that Professor Sai raised issues about subnational comparisons, and Professor Kohli raised issues about categorization of states on the basis of the growth rates. And in both the cases, and the consequences which we discussed in the last 3 speakers' notes, in both the cases, it is the state policies actually which triggered what you call the rise of the centers. Within a country, you consciously promoted some parts of the country as the centers, and you also allow consciously what you call the emergence of the peripheries. So you had centers within a country and the peripheries within the country, and that was done. Mostly we could see that happening in 70s, 80s, and 90s, right? And you had several consequences of such kind of issues. You had conflicts, you had violence, you had unrest, you had demand for smaller states, demands for autonomy in a country like India. But there is a very striking difference between how China dealt with such kind of issues and how India is trying to deal with such kind of issues. In case of China, they changed the track. I think from the 10th five-year plan onwards, they consciously said that on the 10th plan onwards, we will develop the West. So there was a very conscious policy to develop the West, and in the afternoon, Professor Vivian Xu also alluded to that. That is basically moving from the coastal areas to the land frontiers in the southwest China, right? And you give some kind of a governance autonomy to provinces within the southwest provinces. You give a lot of concessions, divert a lot of development resources to this. Whereas in case of India, we are still debating with how to deal with the peripheries, right? We had in the last 3 plans, 4 plans, particularly of the 7th plan in India, we did discuss about how to really reconsider some of the peripheries, the northeast part of it, the tribal belt of it, the border areas, such kind of things. So this is still not a very clear. In the 12th plan also, we have had a very good discussion. I was also involved in the process to see in what way these peripheries concerns can be taken care of. But there is absolutely no clear thinking as far as the state is concerned. The second issue which came up in this morning session, and to a large extent when Professor Lee talked about violence, protest, and such kind of things, is, if you see, and in this morning's presentations when Professor Kapoor mentioned about the backward states, you'll find most of the rich states, right? Most of the resource-rich states in India are the most backward states also, right? You can You can see the mineral resource-rich states. You can see natural resource-rich states. You can biodiversity-rich states. And very interestingly, most of these states are in the borders, right, of India, on the borderlands. You have the border frontiers. Say, for example, the Northeast. Over 98% of the Northeast's border is international, and hardly 2% is with the country, with the nation. And the other important thing about this is the reforms, so-called economic reforms, have not reached substantively these particular states, right? The mainstream in India talks about second-generation reforms today, whereas you will find in the periphery, in these backward states, the first-generation reforms even have not. Nobody debates about these issues, right? So, and the third very interesting characteristic features of these states is these inequalities have triggered a series of protests, violence, unrests, right? And has become a serious internal security and the national security threats, a large-scale instability. And I think in this context, what kind of development interventions are to be done, what kind of institutions are to be created is the second issue. The last point I would like to raise is, in the entire issue of inequality management, both in China and India, and to a large extent in India, not very familiar with what is happening in China, you have newer varieties of challenges, and these challenges are formidable in nature, right? I would say the first challenge, of course, in a country like India is a very sharp erosion in the, institutions which deliver services. If you see the institutions in India, I have had, some kind of a role in number of development policies in the northeast part of India. And I see one of the most striking things we see is the sharp erosion in the entire institutional ethos as far as delivery of services concerned. There are no monitoring and evaluations. You have a policy sent from Delhi on employment generations in the northeast or in the peripheries. Nobody really bothers about it. How does it happen? How does it really ultimately deliver goods? On top of that, you have corruptions, widespread corruptions, right? So what do you do? Will this social audit in case of the national rural employment generations, schemes, will it work, right? The second important challenge is you have now organized violence, organized unrest, right? Against such kind of inequalities. So the state has a serious problem whether to first resolve the unrest or look into the inequality, resolving the inequality question, right? And the third is you will have serious externalities like the consequences or the likely consequences of the climate change, Many people have started seeing this, and this is going to affect. And finally, you'll find you have cross-border mobilizations in case of such kind of unrest. You have the support from the other side of the border. So how will you manage it? So I think the entire question of inequality management is going to be itself is going to be a major and a very, very serious issue. So with these 3 points, I would like to open the floor for discussions. And I would request 2 things. First, your questions, please make your questions as short as possible, and comments also as short. First, I would like to invite Professor Neera Chandok. Okay.
Thank you, Devesh. Just to add a small footnote, you concentrated on the armed forces, and there is certainly a shortfall. But if you look at the paramilitary forces, I suspect you will find a very sharp rise, because the expansion of paramilitary forces actually takes place in the first years of the 1970s in the immediate aftermath of Naxalism. And whether it is CRPF or BSF or, the various paramilitary forces, it are these forces that are engaged in law and order, in quotes, and in putting down riots, including Kashmir. I mean, the army is only in the rural areas. It is the BSF and the CRPF, Indo-Tibetan Police Force, the Border Security Force, that are looking after both the Northeast. So you might find quite a sharp rise and expansion in the paramilitary forces. That's all.
You take, please. Yeah, you let me take this question. We have 10 minutes or so.
Yeah, Prasenjit Dwara from NUS. Just three very short questions to all three, one each. Chingwan Lee, this is a very interesting presentation. Thank you very much. I wonder, what you didn't clarify is who pays for this service, because that, as we know, is the critical issue. I mean, if it's the center government, because otherwise, as we know, the local government in China is part of the problem, right? Because of its financial condition, right? So will this could exacerbate it, or they could just use it as something to absorb from the center? For Vivian, you had mentioned in the beginning that it combined this technocratic plan with market things, but I didn't hear the market part. And what relationship and will delivery of these new services and so on, and you know that you spelt out, how is it tied to the market? And for Devesh, I just wanted you to spell out what is your narrative of the relationship between this terrible state capacity and all these other trends that you were showing us. I mean, how do you think of the relationship, the positive trends of lower crime and things, lower violence?
Okay, we take 4 more questions in the first round. Sanjay, Dong, the gentleman there, and gentleman there. Then next round we'll take Devesh. Yeah, Professor.
Yeah, just very quickly. I thought it was a terrific panel, and the contrast couldn't be more stark. The high-low state capacity of China and Devesh's presentation. So let me ask a mischievous question to Devesh, because I followed your premise. Let's focus from intentions to competence, policies to implementation. So the question is, to what extent are the deficits that you very vividly show related precisely to the things you want to move away from, which are the intentions of the actors and their policies? Now, I think on law and order, it's probably more difficult. But for instance, you started by saying the high state in India has immense capacity. It's the low everyday state that doesn't. And that itself might be related to some of the issues we discussed this morning, which is the lack of attention to basic public services, health, and so on and so forth. Law and order, I think it's more complicated. But to what extent do we still have to keep those together to explain the troubling finding that you were presenting?
Quickly, I think, Dong.
Okay.
Quickly.
I'm Dong Shikui from Beijing Normal University, China. So actually, I have 3 questions related to China's study. First, I have 2 questions to Professor Lee. Actually, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. I would like to say, if you understand China better, you would like to go to deeply to do the on-the-ground study. Thank you very much. My 2 questions. First one, at the end, you are talking about the democratic institutions for dealing with the protest. As far as I know, actually in China, we have kind of institution. I don't know how to translate into English. Whereas from an organization point of view, we have Xinfang Ban. I don't know how to translate in English. And also they have the kind of regulations related to Xinfang. It's called regulation of Xinfang. So I don't know how does this work, this kind of institution, first question. Second one, there's a kind of relationship between the central government and the local government. For example, if the local people want to go to central government to do kind of a protest, what's the relationship between local government and the central government? So how can I balance this? So, I have a question for Professor Xu. When you show the map about the development and protection, By the way, I'm come from the background of conservation. My question is actually in Western China, most of the region are very rich in resources like Xinjiang autonomous region are very rich in coal resources, but Tibetan plateaus are very rich in minerals. But this region actually are very undeveloped. So from your presentation, we can find these areas actually are protected area, but they are still needed to develop. So how to balance this dilemma? That's my question. Thank you.
Straight to questions, please, gentleman there. Then after that.
Thank you. I'm Tang Xiaoyang from IFPRI. And my question is mainly for Professor Li. And so the question is the protests in China today, they are mainly actually not directly caused by poverty and inequality. Like the famous cases I know, they are against like this Chai Qing, against this forced moving, or even Wukan, it's about land issues. It's against the abuse of political power. So it's not really about equality or poverty, but about against political power. And then now the parties, they are, like you described, they use also political power. They do not really use something like a kind of right system, but they are also using political power to compensate these mistakes made by political power. What do you think is consequence? And yeah, so.
Gentleman there, please. Quickly, I'm told we just have 5 more minutes.
Hi, my name is Chris Eberhardt from the New School. I had a question in terms of protests for Professor Li about the visibility or invisibility of the protests. And I was thinking how oftentimes people write about the performative nature of protests in China, and particularly using Beijing as a case study, thinking that Beijing is probably the biggest stage in China. And so when you're thinking about the processes and how protests are controlled, do you need to think, I mean, can you apply the processes used in Beijing for other parts of China?
Professor Atul Kohli.
Thank you so much. Brief questions. Set up a dialogue, if possible, between Vivian Xu and Devesh Kapoor. Vivian, you talked mainly about governmental ambitions, a lot less about the capacity. Sort of what you portrayed there sort of struck me as Jim Scott's nightmare, the sort of rational state trying to go deep down and create harmony through scientific reasoning, you know. It's not going to work, but I want to hear from you, you know, whether this is going to work, or what is your take on capacity? So you focus much more on ambitions, not on capacity. Devesh focused much more on capacity, and I really appreciated it, but I want to reiterate the question Sanjay put to you. How much of capacity reflects lack of ambitions in those particular areas?
The last question, I'm sorry. Gentleman there. Yeah, sorry.
The question's for Ching Kwang Li. As far as they haven't developed the institutions to deal with the protests, but they developed the processes, have you found out what their intellectual history is as far as developing those processes? Where are they getting the inspiration for that from? What techniques have they used from as far as game theory, war theory? You know, you look at Edward Bernays, you know, Freud's nephew and stuff like that.
Okay, we will start with Professor Kapoor to respond. We have about 62 seconds each.
How about 65?
Yeah. Take time? Is that all? How many? Hey, 10 minutes more? Yeah, that'll be 3:15. Yeah, sure, please.
So I'll sort of go through the questions in sort of order. You're absolutely right that the paramilitary forces have increased. In fact, I had this, I didn't have time to go through. Private security has increased massively. So this is the privatization of basic public services. So what you see is now that all middle-class colonies, estates, all have massive growth of private security. So you see there are, but the core basic police which you normally associate with law and order on a day-to-day basis, that has remained largely dysfunctional and much, much smaller. Prasenjit, and this sort of relates to a number of other questions which have come up. I don't have a grand narrative sort of about this, because on the political violence, the factors that have led to the decline of violence in the Jammu and Kashmir are very different from what has happened in the Northeast, is again very distinct from what is happening in the Maoist belt. I do, however, think that political violence has political causes, right? So communal violence is a very apt story. Very much so, it was driven by certain political forces. Those forces are now in retreat, and therefore you see a greater decline of communal violence. With Kashmir, to the extent that considerable amount of support was coming from across the border, after the US went into Afghanistan, pressure was hugely put on Pakistan, so that the infiltration has dropped very sharply, and therefore the violence has also dropped. So each of these, but I do think that in each of these, actually one should, if there's one common narrative, that the Indian state has tried, in this case, one must give the devil his due, has tried to actually initiate political processes, because the answers often to political violence is certain political processes, not just repression by the state. So I think that is at least when it comes to political violence. When it comes to private violence, I do think that market opportunities, that when people are out making a buck, they're probably not as interested in violence. And the clearest case of that is students. So I've not given you data on student strikes. Student strikes in India have dropped precipitously from the 70s and 80s. They are a fraction of, because students are not interested in all of that. They are just interested in how to get a job and make a buck. And that's where I think how markets and market forces are shaping incentives. But again, I cannot show you causally. These are just relations. The point that Atul made and Sanjay made, I'll try and sort of link that. The distinction between the high and the low state, and whether capabilities or capacities, in a sense, is endogenous to government ambitions. One of the interesting dichotomies here is that the high state we essentially associate in India with Delhi, which is the federal institutions, planning, finance, the central bank, etc. The low state, which is about public services, is really services provided by state governments. Constitutionally, primary education, primary health, law and order is a state-level subject. The puzzle in this is why, when Indian democracy is much more representative now than it was 40, 50 years ago, and UP and Bihar are very good examples, where the lower caste parties actually have serious real power, have they been so uninterested in deploying better public services, even to their own members, right? Because that's what you would normally expect in a democracy. Old elites were not interested because this was not their social groups. The whole point of the democracy is that representation, better representation should lead to better outcomes, at least on these basics. And that has simply not happened. So that what is interesting is that in these states, even as representation became better, even these social groups and the poor actually sought out market options, so that if you see in UP and Bihar, actually have the greatest deal of privatization of primary health and primary education, where the poorest groups are seeking private education, even though they hardly have the resources to sort of do that. And that I don't have the right answer.
Please, Professor Weaver.
Let me take the three questions in reverse order. I think that'll make more sense. Atul, your question about how do I see capacity here? When I talked to Vice Minister Yang Wei-min, who's one of the architects of this master plan, I asked him what was going to be the most difficult part of implementing it, and he surprised me by saying finding the money. Okay. And as I've looked into it more and more, and I didn't have time to present the implementation mechanisms for this, it involves a first stage of enormous intense negotiations and bargainings with local levels, provincial and below, to get people and officials to agree to terms for the foregone development that they will have over generations to come as a result of being classified in one category or another for their regions, and also the money that they will require for being dislocated and moved to other areas if they're, and having whole new communities constructed for them. So we are looking at, something that will stretch out over many, many years and be very, very expensive. And this is where the parallel that I didn't have time to make with Qin Kuan's paper, I think, is really very important, and that is how much people expect to be compensated by the state for inconveniences and for policies that interfere with their own aspirations, and how much the state expects to have to pay. And this will come in various forms in terms of implementation. Opposition to these policies will be bought off with promises of subsidies and transfers and compensatory payments and rewards to officials who do well at implementing the plans, preferential investments, tax breaks, buyouts, land swaps, and other kinds of managed schemes in which the state plays a very important role and is the primary funder. And again, that's where any potential fiscal crisis of the state and purchasing this kind of cooperation and compliance is probably the thing to look for. Now, I agree with Qin Kuan on that. But also, this is where the market or private interest may enter the picture, because in order for many of these functions to be carried out, the state alone will not be able to do it. It will have to generate and engender the development of new corporations and service providers in these different areas to take on many of these tasks. And it will lay out the plan of what's needed, and it will expect entrepreneurs to find these opportunities, and it will offer them low-interest loans. It will offer them good tax rebates and other kinds of deals for going in to these areas and taking up some of these tasks that even the local states haven't got the funds to cover. And quick response on your interesting question about mining. When areas are demarcated that are resource-rich, as you say, but they're demarcated for protection, what that means is that mining and resource exploitation is to be permitted to carry on insofar as possible, because the state does not want to forgo those resources. But they will have to conform to international best practices of environmental protection and cleanliness. That's supposed to be the stipulation that applies. And once again, you can see, I mean, given the temptations for that not to prevail, and the weakness at the bottom of the state to actually oversee, it will require that a whole lot of surveillance will be taking place all of the time. And I have to say, just as a final throwaway, that the people in public administration in Tsinghua University who are training the next level generations of public administrators are very clear that the quality of the people that they need must be very, very high, and that they must be skilled at using high technology. A lot of faith is put in satellite imaging for surveilling the whole of the nation, where environmental protection and these other regionalizations and zoning is concerned.
Thank you, Professor Lee.
Who pays? Local governments pay, and they have worked out a very informal but systematic method where whoever causes the problem will have to pay to pay out to protesters. So if it is a city government that has decided to build a university city and thereby demolishing homes and provoke protests, then the city government has to provide the money to pay out for these protesters. If it is a street-level government that has made some mistakes and caused a protest, then the street-level government will have to pay. So there is a very kind of nice informal accountability system, physically. But you're right. I mean, and together with what Vivian just said, we're looking at a time bomb if the local government has committed to so many economic, environmental, and political tasks, and all they can think of, or the major means, is through the market and commodifying people's right by paying. Everything is now become something you can pay and buy and sell. And that exactly is the answer that I would give to the consequences of using this kind of paying off people. In the long run, it's going to erode, and I think it has already eroded state authority. Because what is authority if officials' order are followed only after payment is made? But on the reverse is what is citizen rights if you don't really get what you're due, but you compromise all the time, you don't get 100% of your due owed wages, but you settle for 50%. So I think both rights and authority are being commodified to the extent that they have lost much of their original meaning. And again, so that would set us in a very a very contrasting picture to the literature's suggestion that we're seeing a stronger authoritarianism, stronger state, and stronger citizen rights, which our study cast in doubt. The question about petition, 上访, what you suggest is what I have in petition, and is part of this bureaucratic game, one of the games that many people play. And it is since 1992 where there has been explicit policy documents from the center that says that local authorities, and by local is as local as you can get, jurisdictional management, that is these responsibilities for maintaining stability has really been devolved to the street level, the lowest level. That's why we explicitly conceptualize this level and calling it grassroots state. And it is a state that really tries to build roots into society. Inequality, you're right, a lot of that has to do with the extreme imbalance of political power between citizens and officials that have caused many of these protests. But I would argue also that many of these conflicts have been caused by market development that has to do with workers' right, land right, peasants' land rights, and homeowners' property rights. So they are both class-based, but also politically engendered. So they're kind of dual. I think political inequality has a lot of times compounded, complicated conflicts that have been caused by the market that are based more on class interests. Beijing as the best stage for performative politics, and therefore this study may be skewed. I prefaced my presentation with the fact that I don't claim to extend my argument to all of China, although I think in big cities we tend to see the state deploying these kinds of means, whereas in rural China, as the blind lawyer that has made headlines recently, his location is really in the rural area where the state can get really violent and thuggish. And so these mechanisms are by no means applicable to all of China. Where did they learn these methods? I don't think they read game theories and all of that. But in a recent conference that Vivian organized, some of the more historically minded China scholars reminded me that in imperial China, there has been records that local state actually also have this practice of bargaining with protests, but I don't know how regular it is. Right now, what we're seeing is really systematic, and the officials told us that it all started in 2008, during the Olympic years, when the government was really anxious in preserving the appearance of stability, and the quickest way that you can really pacify protesters is by giving them, resolving issues with cash. And since then, it has proved to be very successful. So other Olympics in other countries sort of unleashed democratization, but in China, it just gave the state the opportunity to learn a new kind of stagecraft, and now they have codified. I mean, in documents, you can actually say, the government said, we are going to codify this system of stability preservation under the name of social management. And on a more mundane kind of level, during our fieldwork, I actually sat in hours and hours of cadre training where successful examples of controlling protest and maintaining stability will be spread and diffused in these workshops where people will talk about how they have dealt with protests in their jurisdiction to other officials responsible for stability maintenance coming from other jurisdictions, and that's how they learn. They have flow charts. I mean, I have documents of those if you want to see them. So it's really by learning and spreading, and all now they're calling innovation, and everybody's encouraged to innovate. And so whenever they succeed in devising a strategy, and they will be rewarded, claimed a model, and then it will be spread by these cadre training workshops. So thank you very much.
That's how you do public administration.
Yeah, that's